Okay, great. Thank you. We were waiting for the voice announcement too. So while Caitlin's doing that, I'm gonna introduce her. Caitlin Godfrey is the Restoration Forth Community Engagement Lead, working with the project partners to deliver a range of public engagement events around the work that's been happening in the Firth of Forth. She's responsible for finding innovative ways to involve people in oyster and seagrass restoration, as well as advocacy and citizen science opportunities. And we're super excited to have her talking with us here today. If you have any questions for Caitlin during her talk, please pop them in the chat. Annie and I will be monitoring that, and we can do a question session at the end. So thank you very much for joining us, Caitlin, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
That's lovely, Claire. Thanks very much for that. Hopefully you've got a nice title screen on your screen. And as Claire said, if we could do some questions at the end, folks, if you think of anything you want to ask me, that would be fab. I can't see anyone now, I'm screen sharing. So if you have any issues with the sound or the visuals, please just come off mute and shout at me. That would be grand. So as Claire said, my name is Caitlin. I work for the Marine Conservation Society. I'm sure a lot of you here are familiar with MCS. We are a UK-based marine conservation charity, and we are working towards a healthier, a cleaner, and a better protected ocean. But I work on a fantastic project called Restoration Forth, and I work as the community engagement lead for this project, kind of coordinating all of the different community engagement activities that we do as part of our project. So, to dive right in, we're going to start at the very beginning. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of our project, how we started, where we're going, how we've been doing. I'll touch on the species restoration work that we've been doing, and then also talk a bit about some of the community engagement activities that we run as well. So for those of you who haven't heard of us or are not familiar with the project, we're a marine restoration project based in the Firth of Forth in Scotland. We first launched in 2022, so we've been running for just under 4 years now, and we've got current funding which takes us through to the end of March next year. And our main focus is around species restoration, most notably around native oyster and seagrass restoration. And as part of our work, we also aim to involve local people in all those stages of restoration as we go. And I think it's important to note that this is a bit of a trial project. Nobody has ever tried to introduce native oysters or restore seagrass in this area. So we're really kind of learning as we go. And like many of these types of projects, I suppose this is a real partnership project. So it's not just MCS, it's a whole host of other interesting organisations and charities. So currently we have 8 project partners. We have WWF, who are our project managers. They look after the day-to-day runnings of Restoration Forth, and they also look after a lot of the advocacy and the fundraising work for us too. We work really closely with Heriot-Watt University, who are an Edinburgh-based university who have a marine science team, and they are here to help on our oyster science work. So they really lead on the oyster science restoration aspect of the project. And then similarly, on the other side of that, we also work with Project Seagrass, who bring the seagrass science element to the project. And then the other partners, we sort of call them they're maybe slightly smaller, our community hubs. So they're generally charities that are place-based within the Firth of Forth area, who've already got really good connections to local communities and are already doing some form of environmental work or volunteering opportunities in the area. So we've got the Scottish Seabird Centre in North Berwick, the Ecology Centre over in Fife, Fife Coast and Countryside Trust, based in Fife, and Edinburgh Shoreline, who are an Edinburgh-based community group. And on your screen now is just a map of our project area, just to kind of help you centre yourself. So this is an image of the outer Firth of Forth, and our project area runs right from roundabout Dunbar on the right-hand side of your screen, all the way along the East Lothian coastline, past Edinburgh to the bridges at Queensferry, and then along the northern side of that coastline, which is the Fife coastline. And on the map here, we've got several kind of red spots. That's just to show you where all of our project partners are based and to give you an idea of our sort of project scope in that sense. So folks, actually, before I talk about seagrass, I just wanted to talk about this basin slightly more. So as you can probably imagine, this is one of the busiest areas of sea and coastline in all of Scotland. Obviously, we've got Edinburgh, and we've got thousands and thousands of folk living in Edinburgh, but we've also got a real history of industry in this area. And more recently, we've got a lot of people who are taking to the coastline and the Firth of Forth for fun as well and for pleasure. So it's a very busy space in which we're working. So folks, I mentioned our two key species that we're working on restoration, and I'm going to talk you through a bit about our seagrass work to begin with, and then move on to our native oysters. I appreciate that a lot of you are probably really familiar with these two species, and you might be quite familiar with other projects that are also working on restoration of these two species. But just to serve as a bit of a reminder, seagrass is a plant like any other plant. It has roots, it has leaves, it has flowers, but it can live within marine waters, and it can survive within the salty environment, which sets it apart really from the plants that grow on land. This is a quote which really just highlights, I suppose, the level of loss that we've seen in UK seagrass over the years. So since 1936, which is when official records really began around seagrass, we've lost about 40% of the seagrass that we did have within the UK. And I think that's probably quite a conservative figure. Other reports suggest much higher numbers, maybe even around the 90% figure, which has been lost over those years. Now, across the world, there are around 60 different species of seagrass, but we only have two in the UK, which makes it kind of easy. We have the eelgrass, or Zostra marina, which is the larger variety. It normally lives in subtidal conditions, and it's a bit thicker than our other species, which is the dwarf eelgrass, or Zostra nultii, which is a much finer hair-like species, which is often found growing on the higher shore in the intertidal zone. And I think the photograph on the left-hand side just kind of really shows the two species quite nicely. We've got both of them growing in amongst each other in that image. And just a reminder then that seagrass can look different depending on where on earth you are in the UK or the world. This is a fantastic photo of some intertidal seagrass down on the Isle of Wight on the south coast of the UK. This image is probably kind of linked to what you might be a bit more familiar with when you see seagrass being promoted, this kind of lovely, beautiful, clear blue water. We've got some amazing charismatic species that are associated with seagrass, things like turtles and manatees as well. So this is some subtidal seagrass in the Maldives. And then this is in Scotland. This is actually up on Orkney, right on the north coast of Scotland. This is some of the subtidal seagrass that they have growing there. And this is what we're working with in the Firth of Forth. So this just really serves to illustrate to you, hopefully, the kind of difference in, even within a small area, the difference in seagrass, how it's presented growing along our shorelines. So this is a photo of some seagrass that was taken at Belhaven Bay in East Lothian, which is one of our restoration sites. And then just as a reminder for you all again about why we care about seagrass, why we want to try and restore it, like many other species, it provides a whole range of ecosystem services. It's a really good blue carbon store because it sequesters carbon through its root system and then kind of cements that carbon into the sediment below it. It's also a really good habitat for lots of different species. So in that sense, it's great for supporting and enhancing biodiversity. It can be a great nursery habitat for young fish, and other species like pipefish, crabs, and anemones also love to live in seagrass meadows. And then finally, it can really lend a helping hand to helping to protect our coastlines as well. As we see more and more storm events hitting our coastlines and eroding the shoreline, seagrass can be really good at absorbing some of that wave energy and helping to stabilise the shoreline through its root system. So to return then, folks, to our project area, we're back in the Firth of Forth. We have fragmented pockets, I suppose, of seagrass, both varieties of seagrass growing along areas of the Firth of Forth. None of it is particularly healthy. And we've done some work to sort of really map those areas and to understand the full extent of some of those seagrass patches. But kind of working on what we already knew was growing in the Firth of Forth, we established 3 restoration sites that we wanted to trial seagrass restoration in. And the idea was that we would set up restoration next to sites that already had some seagrass. So the idea was to really try and bulk up the existing seagrass populations that were already in the Firth of Forth. So we have one site over on the north coast in Fife, near Burn Island and Kinghorn, one site down by the bridges near Edinburgh, which is near the Cramond area, if you're familiar with that, and then one site right over in East Lothian near Dunbar. And as a team, we decided that we would trial the seed planting method, which I'll talk through the steps of it just now and explain to you how we got to where we are. So the first thing to do was to decide upon a donor meadow, and that would be a seagrass meadow that was happy and healthy and from which we could harvest some seeds from. And the sites that we chose were actually all based in Orkney. On the map on the left here, you can see the 3 stars which designate the different sites that we harvested seagrass seeds from. And we did this during the summertime, and that's because obviously that's the time when our seeds are sort of ready, ripe and ready on those seagrass stems for collection. And this proved to be a really interesting community engagement opportunity, I suppose, for some people. We were able to take out small groups of volunteers snorkeling and really get people familiar with some of the seagrass meadows in Orkney, and then obviously get them involved in the actual hand picking of those seeds as well. And once we collected that material, we then took all of the seeds and the plant matter back down here to the Firth of Forth, which is where we carried out our seed processing work. And you can see in the photos on the left-hand side, we've got some indoor sessions with volunteers. And what we're doing here is hand picking out the seagrass seeds from the rest of the plant material. They were then processed within the seed processing facility at North Berwick, and they were looked after over the winter time to kind of keep them in a dormant state before they were ready for planting. And again, thinking about community engagement, these sessions were really positively, they went really well, I think, for the team, because they were super accessible. You're indoors, you don't need any prior knowledge or training, you can just come along and have a go at picking out seeds from plant matter. And we also found that actually the social aspect of these events was really important for lots of people. It was a time to catch up and have a chat and have a cup of tea as well. So once our seeds have sat in the facility over the winter time, we then came into the following spring, and that is when our seeds were ready to be planted. And we did this using the DIS method, which is the dispenser injection seeding method. And you can see in the image on your screen that we simply use caulking guns, which we filled up with local sediment and a mixture of the seeds, and then we injected that seed and sediment into the shoreline at our restoration sites. Last year, as well as our seeding, we also trialled some transplanting of the smaller variety of seagrass, the Zostria knowltii, and that's done by kind of pulling up the whole plant, which was already growing at one of our sites, and then planting it into a new area to see if it could take and bulk up in that new area. Now, the results so far, folks, have been quite interesting. And I think if any of you are familiar with seagrass restoration work, you're possibly quite familiar with some of the challenges to this type of work as well. What we found over the course of Restoration Forth is that we've unfortunately had pretty low germination rates of the seeds at all 3 of our restoration sites. Now, we think that's due to a real mix of factors. We think that there's a real challenge in the Firth of Forth with poor water quality. We've got high levels of pollution, we've got high levels of nitrogen, and we've got quite limited light as well, all things that seagrass doesn't particularly like. Over the winter time, also, we were subject to some really intense winter storms which battered our coastlines, and we think that that has also done quite a lot of damage and potentially ripped out some of our seed bank. So what we've decided to do this year is actually put a pause on our restoration work And Project Seagrass are taking the lead in monitoring and going back out and mapping our seagrass meadows. And what they're hopefully going to do is pull together a big data set and tell us in the new year what recommendations they might have. It might be that we need to return to this issue of water quality monitoring before we trial any more seagrass restoration work. Okay, folks, so I'm going to move on now to our native oysters. Again, I'm sure a lot of you are quite familiar with our native oysters. It's quite a key species that comes up quite a lot in restoration work around the UK. Just a reminder, though, for those of you who need it, which is that native oysters also provide a whole range of ecosystem services like seagrass does as well. So for Restoration Forth, we were really interested in a few different services. One of them is that oysters can help increase water clarity as they're filter feeders, and they filter out a lot of the impurities and the sediment that's floating around in the water. We were also interested in biodiversity enhancement. So again, like a lovely seagrass meadow, an established oyster bed can form a really unique and complex structure that provides great habitat and shelter for a range of species. And then finally, for our project, this idea of cultural value. So the idea that actually oysters were part of a really colourful and interesting history of lots of coastal communities. And that's what I'd like just to spend a few moments just talking you through before we go into our restoration steps for oysters. So I'd like to transport you back now to the 1800s, and we're in the Firth of Forth, and what we're seeing during this time is a hugely successful, vibrant, thriving fishing industry. And now this industry is focused not only on fishing oysters, but also fishing herring, and also the handpicking of mussels from the numerous mussel beds that once grew along the shoreline. The image on the right-hand side of the screen is of Mrs. Flucker. This is quite a famous image of Mrs. Flucker. She's an oyster seller, and she's dressed in the traditional dress of the oyster seller. She's wearing her striped skirt, and she's also got her basket of oysters by her side as well. So she would sling that basket onto her back, fill it with oysters, and she would sell oysters in the streets of Edinburgh. So oysters during this time were hugely important as part of many people's diets. They were really the poor man's food. They were used to bulk out people's diets who weren't getting enough protein, and oysters were literally 10 a penny during this period. This map is quite an astonishing map, actually, I think, of the oyster fishing grounds during this time. And you can see at the bottom in the middle of the screen, there's teeny tiny Edinburgh, and then the big main road that goes out to Leith. So this is when the two were separate. And within the Firth of Forth, we've got these huge oyster beds, which are all kind of split up into different fishing grounds. And as you can imagine, during this period, there was a huge amount of controversy and infighting and debate over who owned which areas of the oyster scalps. And fishermen were known to have many brawls on the sea and on land as well about who owned which parts of the oyster beds. So this period then in the 1800s is really characterized by huge slumps and booms in oyster productivity. At the real peak of the oyster bed here in the Firth of Forth, the bed measured 20 miles long and it was 6 miles wide, which, just to kind of give you an idea of what that means, that's the same size as the city of Edinburgh is today. So it was absolutely vast. At the peak of the production period, we had around 30 million oysters that were being fished out of the Firth of Forth every year. And they were not only being sold in the streets of Edinburgh, but also taken across to Glasgow, taken down to London as well to be sold elsewhere. And we know from reports during this period that not only adult oysters were being fished, we also know that young oysters were being taken, and that's because they were being taken to help restock some of the exhausted oyster beds further down south, so particularly in the Thames and the Medway. I'm sure you can imagine probably how this story goes. We know from reports that several fishermen were kind of raising the alarm about the Firth of Forth oyster bed. They were reporting that the bed was showing signs of exhaustion. They were reporting that they weren't fishing nearly as many oysters as they had historically. And unfortunately, this practice continued and continued until by the end of the 1800s, the Firth of Forth oyster bed was completely fished out. So by that time, by the kind of early 1900s, native oysters were declared locally extinct within this area, and we haven't seen them within this basin for over 100 years, right up until Restoration Forth put them back. So folks, it's a little bit different, I suppose, to our seagrass work in that we didn't have any native oysters to even start with. So our work was really around drilling down into our site selection, trying to work out which areas within the Firth of Forth might be good for oyster restoration. We looked at sediment type, we looked at activity that was focusing on certain areas. We looked at some associated species that might already be living there. And what we came up with is 4 sites for restoration, 2 which are in the subtidal area of the Firth of Forth. They're about 10 to 12 metres deep, and 2 in the intertidal areas. And we kind of like really pushed for, I suppose, community engagement at those intertidal sites. And that was a really important part of the site selection process, is that actually we do have some sites that are located close to our communities and are accessible for our communities. So to begin with then, bearing in mind that we had absolutely no native oysters left in our project area, we went off to go and find a supplier. And actually there are a number of oyster growers who are all based on the west coast of Scotland, who all grow native oysters for restoration purposes. And the photos on your screen is one of the farms that we go to, that we get our native oysters from, and there's another few dotted around the coastline as well. So we had our suppliers on board and we went and bought native oysters from several of them. We then brought them back to Heriot-Watt University campus, and that's where we went through this really important step in this process, which is called biosecurity. And biosecurity exists so that we make sure that we don't accidentally introduce disease or unwanted species into our project area. So our oysters in particular, and all shellfish actually that close up, are really good carriers for disease because they can hold that within their bodies and within the water in their shells too. So what we did is we invited lots of our volunteers to campus, and we went through the first stage in this process, which is physically scraping the oyster shells and cleaning the barnacles, the keel worms, the mussels, whatever else was attached to those shells off them. And we then dip our oysters in formaldehyde for 2 minutes. And the point of that is just to kill any disease that's still attached onto the outside of the shell. And then the oysters go into the depuration tanks, which we call our oyster spa, which is full of sterilised seawater, and the oysters are then flushed through over the course of several days to, again, just get rid of any possible disease or parasites that they're holding within their shells. And then we get to the really fun bit, which is our oyster deployment. So depending on which site we're at, we either go out on our boat and throw our oysters in, or if we're at our intertidal zones, then we just need wellies for everybody, and we can go out at a low tide and spread our oysters. So as long as we're in our licensed area for restoration, we can throw our oysters by hand right into the sea, and they'll settle down naturally where they end up. So our results so far then of our oyster work, I'm pleased to say it's been really, really successful so far. We have so far deployed 46,000 native oysters at our 4 sites, and our survivability rates are really, really good at the moment, bearing in mind we're only in possibly year 3, I think, from the first time we put oysters in. But we are seeing survivability of between 75 to 90%, which is fantastic. And that's based at 3 of our sites where we've run our survival experiments. And we're also just beginning to build some data around associated species with our oysters too. And we've done that by dropping BRUV surveys, so doing our baited remote underwater videos, which are dropped down onto the seabed and left for a length of time. And then we'll have a look at the footage manage to see what is around and about our oysters. And the image on the screen is a still from one of those video clips. We've got a lovely crab and a starfish and a sea urchin all next to one of our oysters. So folks, I'm going to give you a quick break from listening to me, as I appreciate it's quite a long time of talking. What I'm going to do is share a quick video with you, which is Restoration Forth, the story so far. And the point of this video is, again, just to kind of cement some of the stuff that I've spoken to you about this afternoon. It really brings, I think, the story of our project to life. And importantly, in this video, there's also a whole range of the volunteers speaking as well, which is a really important part of our project. So I'm going to play this, folks. I'm going to pray to the technological gods that the sound works. But if the sound doesn't work, if somebody just wants to hop off mute and shout at me, and we'll see what we can do. This video is about 6 minutes long, and then we'll come back and I'll finish off just talking to you about our community engagement work. So bear with.
It's a great feeling of hope for the future that we're putting something back into the environment, and in my lifetime I think that's really worthwhile.
This is the story of Restoration Forth, a project which brings together communities and organisations to make waves for a brighter future. Scotland is home to some of the most incredible wildlife and habitats in the world. But nature's in trouble, with 1 in 9 Scottish species at risk of extinction. Since 2022, communities and organisations have been working together to restore wildlife and habitats by trialling seagrass restoration and reintroducing European flat oysters to the Firth of Forth. Let's take a look back.
I just love seeing the impact of small things. People think of conservation and they think of elephants and tigers. They don't think of the small things which make up that tangled bank of animals and ecosystems, which is so important. It's sort of close to my heart because it's somewhere where I live, and eventually I'll see it progress somewhere like Grangemouth.
You hear a lot about global warming and the biodiversity crisis, and seagrass brings those two things together and hopefully helps to improve both of them. Restoring the seagrass beds should help improve the coastal environment and make a big difference. And Restoration Forth, I think, is great because it brings together the communities around the Forth itself.
You know, at a time of life where I was not working due to health issues, you know, basically nature heals. I was just really ready for something like this. As a layperson, you know, knowing nothing about seagrass, never having heard about it before, to learning that there was, you know, a project on my doorstep. I just think it's brilliant that there are projects like this. The organisations who've got knowledge, the skills, and then bringing in community as well. I think this is the way forward.
We've learned a lot, but restoration doesn't come without its challenges. What the project has discovered has been incredibly helpful and will support future restoration projects. Seagrass works in harmony with oysters, and together they provide refuge to many animals, protect coastlines and remove pollutants from the water, making it safer for us all.
These oysters, although they're so small, what they do is really important for the ecosystem. And, you know, I think one day that people are going to look at the Firth of Forth and they're going to be like, wow, it looks so good and so clear. And they're going to be like, this is what we do like matters.
While you're scrubbing the oyster, you build up a personal connection with the species. The communities I work with are mostly migrants from cities like Hong Kong or other parts of Asia. And we barely have any chance to be connected to nature too much where we were from. It's a great opportunity for us to know about the natural habitat in Scotland.
I think it's really important to be doing collaborative projects like this one where you bring all the actors together. This sort of project is going to work best when you get the local people involved, and then they'll take on more stewardship and make friends too.
We love oysters!
Get set, fire!
Communities play a huge role in looking after our coastline. The oyster beds were once abundant, the fish were once abundant, the seabirds were once abundant. My heart and soul is with the people that are trying to restore the biodiversity of the Firth of Forth.
I was inspired by the really wide variety of stories that different people brought to the Restoration Forth project and to their connections to oysters themselves. So it was really interesting thinking about the potential future stories that could exist through the effect of the Restoration Forth project.
Well, I was brought up in the Haven, went to Victoria School. My playground was in the Haven Harbour. Used to wait on the boats coming in and see what our catch was. No, really happy to see the oysters going back in the water and getting the habitat back to what it was. My hopes are that it goes from strength to strength.
I live through Middlesex County on me. The oyster love springs, like each the sea, with music and song as time passes by. We hear in the distance the real lassie's cry. Callaroo, 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 bring the Forth, callaroo, callaroo. Say here's to the boatmen that aim and down bar. At Kirk and the fair, there's Lincoln's sick hall, and we'll be their days. Say blithesome and fair, their voices in evening is music to hear. Callaroo, 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 bring the Forth, callaroo, callaroo.
Okay, folks, hopefully that brings to life a little bit the work of our project. Hopefully the sound all worked for you as well, but I'm happy to drop the link in the chat if you'd like to go back and watch that in full as well. So just to finish off with then, everyone, before we go to questions, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk you through our community engagement work as a really important, I suppose, part of Restoration Forth. So broadly speaking, we have split our community engagement work into a number of work streams. As with many projects, we kind of started with a awareness raising work stream, which is quite light touch. The team were out and about at festivals, at stands, spreading the word about Restoration Forth and trying to get people involved and interested. But a relatively passive form of engagement, not kind of really expecting anybody to necessarily want to take anything up. Once we kind of built a bit of an interest base, though, we've taken on what we call our key volunteers, and they come and get involved in a number of different events. We've got a really strong work stream based around training, which is around educating and upskilling local people in new skills. Lots of those new skills are based around restoration techniques, like I mentioned, so things like biosecurity, seagrass seed processing, the seagrass planting, and the oyster deployment as well. But we've also taught some people some different skills around maybe advocacy and being able to answer consultations as well. And then the final area of community engagement that we work on is all around citizen science. So at Marine Conservation Society, we've already got a whole range of different citizen science opportunities for people to get involved in. But what we actually did for Restoration Forth is develop some new kind of properly oyster focused citizen science that we've then rolled out to some of our communities as well. So just some numbers. This is slightly updated from the video that I just showed you. So far we've had around 15,000 direct engagements. And what that means is people coming to an event and volunteering at something for Restoration Forth. Over the time that we've been running, we've had 780,000 indirect engagements, and that's much more passive. That's around people maybe coming to an exhibition and reading a display board about Restoration Forth, and that's the numbers that we've had just there. Just under 3,000 volunteers have been trained up in restoration techniques specifically. And we've worked really hard within our project to engage what we've called a diverse range of audiences, which is quite open to interpretation, but really trying to embed EDI practices within all of our work. Think about the barriers to restoration, think about the barriers to volunteering for lots of people, and trying to engage with a diverse range of groups. A really successful part of our engagement work has been to really work with those smaller community hubs that I mentioned at the start, who've already got often a venue in an area around the Firth of Forth, and you've already got some of those existing contacts and relationships with different groups around the area. And so, folks, I'm just going to finish off really with some nice photos to show you some of our engagement work. This is really focused on the kind of more out-of-the-box, broader engagement work that we've done. I've already talked a bit about the restoration skills and the monitoring that we've had volunteers help us with, but thinking about other ways that we've tried to get people involved and interested in Restoration Forth. One of them is through our art activities and our celebration day that we had at the Heart of Newhaven. We employed a local artist to come and run some oyster art workshops with us, and we had a little poetry session as part of that too. We had face painting, we had colouring sheets, and we also had the local community choir perform some traditional oyster songs as well, which is what you saw at the end of that video that I just showed you. Within that video as well, you will have seen that we had this fantastic oyster mural painted on the side of one of the buildings of the Heart of Newhaven. And you can see it's got the native oysters right at the back, and then in front of the oysters are some of the associated species and some of the history associated with oyster fishing too. So that was a really exciting day, a really fantastic unveiling event that we ran, and again, working with the community choir to really celebrate the success of this work. Citizen science is again a really important part of our engagement work. So like I mentioned, we've developed a whole suite actually of brand new oyster citizen science activities. I think if any of you were at the SAIM conference in Stirling in October, you might have seen the video that my colleague Kirsty Crawford sent in, and I think she talked a bit more in depth then about the development of the citizen science work. But we wanted to really involve people in finding different areas for oyster restoration. And we did that by creating 2 new surveys, which were pretty quick, accessible surveys that people could just do when they were out and about to try and identify different potential areas for restoration. And then we also created 2 other surveys, which were a bit more involved, which were based around the monitoring of the intertidal oysters that we had already restored as well. And we would take out small groups of volunteers to come and monitor those oysters. And then we have run several snorkel sessions. It's a really great way to get people to really experience the marine environment for themselves. And we've had some really, really successful snorkel sessions, in particular partnering up with SWT, the Scottish Wildlife Trust, who really know this stuff, and taking out small groups, some completely new people to snorkeling who got to experience it for themselves. Sorry about the bar. I think if that keeps popping up, it's just the tab from Zoom that keeps coming up as comments are coming in. And then finally, just to finish off, thinking again about the art and the cultural heritage side of all this important environmental work, we've managed to reach thousands and thousands of people through our exhibitions. So the photo on the left-hand side is a really beautiful arts exhibition that was in the Lighthouse in the Isle of May for all of summer this year. And then on the right-hand side, we've just launched a new display board for Restoration Forth at the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. So if you're ever at the Botanics, do go and have a look at that. It's in the John Hope Gateway. And I think that brings me to the end of my talk. Thanks so much for listening. I will stop sharing my screen, and if anyone's got any questions, pop them in the chat or stick your hand up and we can discuss them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. That was great. It was really inspiring to hear how well your project's going. And yeah, the community engagement work, yeah, super impressive, really cool. There are a few questions in the chat, but I'm going to be cheeky and take chair's privilege and sneak one in before we get to those. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit to your volunteer recruitment. That seems to be an amazingly successful campaign. So could you maybe just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely, Claire. So I think it's important to not reinvent the wheel. And actually, we say this quite a lot in our project. There are already fantastic charities, organisations, networks that exist within a lot of these areas, right? So we try quite hard to not work from scratch. We've really lent on the experience of some of our community hubs who already work with diverse groups. And through those relationships, we've worked with the Regional Equalities Council, which is based in Edinburgh, which works with new migrants to Edinburgh. We've worked with the BSL group, we've worked with the Royal Blind School. I think it's about, you've got to keep banging your drum, haven't you? And you can't just expect people to come to you. So we've kind of kept at it for several years now. I think particularly the kind of art and more the cultural heritage work that we've done has been a really nice way to get volunteers in who actually initially maybe wouldn't think that they would be interested in marine restoration, but actually getting them to an event where we do some seaweed printing or whatever it might be is a really nice foot in the door for them to become a bit more invested. We already have, and we always have had a really, really highly engaged small group of core volunteers who are sort of your usual suspects. And I don't say that in a mean way, like we absolutely love them, but they're generally retired, they've generally got time on their hands, they've generally got an interest already in marine environmental stuff. So it was really just about thinking about how we could, reach other people who might not immediately be that interested.
That's great, thank you. We have got a few questions in the chat. Just for ease of moving the session along, I will read those out, but feel free to keep adding some new ones. The first one is from Arthur Keller, and he says, wonderful project. I just wondered at the difference in success between introducing seagrass and introducing oysters. Is there some kind of dependency there? Could we expect different results when both species are present on the site? And do you think there would be better seagrass results once the oysters are more established?
Yeah, that's a great question, Arthur. Yes to all of those questions. So what we are learning as we go is that actually it seems that our reintroduced oysters can cope pretty well with the state of the Forth. And those high nutrient levels, high nitrogen levels that I mentioned, and partly because actually that's because they're filtering some of that out. It seems that our seagrass is not particularly happy in those conditions. We do have one site in East Lothian where we've got oysters and seagrass basically next to each other, which is a really interesting part of our study. The seagrass is really suffering at the moment, and our oysters are really happy. Over time, hopefully what we'd love to see is our oysters continuing to filter out some of that nitrogen, which will support the seagrass, but also filtering out some of that sediment that's floating around in the water column as well. And as we move more towards cleaner, clearer water, we can expect our seagrass to be more successful in being able to survive in those conditions. So I think really we want to tackle this issue of water quality and putting more oysters in, and then we can see the impact on the other species. Yeah.
Thank you. Next one from Sahara Stevenson Jones, who's loving the murals and was just asking whether you'd shared your resources with Nora. I'm afraid I don't know what Nora is, but if you don't, perhaps Sahara.
Yeah, so Nora, I'm going to get this wrong. Nora is the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance. That seems plausible. But it is essentially a huge network of native oyster restoration practitioners all across Europe, possibly worldwide. Might have got that wrong. No, actually, we haven't. That's a great point, and maybe I'll put it on my list to do later, is to share the citizen science that we have created. We did present a poster on the citizen science work that we had done at the last NORA conference, and I've got some colleagues who are going to it in a couple of weeks as well, to the next one, to talk a bit more about our work.
Thank you. And thank you for telling me what NORA is. David Sutherland is asking about funding. He says some very nice things about your project too, which you can read later. But he says, you mentioned funding is due to end in March of next year. Is it likely this will get extended and allow for further opportunities to volunteer, or just continue the project generally?
So that's the million-dollar question, David. So I'll tackle actually the second part of your question, which is whether there are opportunities for volunteering. There definitely are. As we go into winter, kind of naturally, we just wind down our activities. We don't do field work or anything really during winter. But as we go into the spring, we will be doing our oyster biosecurity once again. So if you're interested, it's all through our MCS Eventbrite page. I can drop a link in the chat at the end. So that's all run through Marine Conservation Society. We have funding to hit our next target, which will take us to 50,000 oysters restored. So there's going to be 2 blocks of biosecurity in the springtime, if you're interested. And then in terms of what's next, we are awaiting a number of funding outcomes, and we hope to have a bit more of an idea probably by the end of this year about what funding comes through, whether we are successful, and from then we can make a bit of a plan as to what happens to Restoration Forth.
Well, thank you. Annie from SIME Scotland's actually got the next one, so I'll let her ask her own question.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, the Scotland Conference on Source to Sea, we did hear from Kirsty at MCS, and again, a lot on the citizen science aspects, but we also had a talk from Alex Thompson.
Oh, is Annie frozen for me, or have I frozen for everybody else?
Maybe I shouldn't have let Annie talk.
She's gone.
From Sea Welding at Loch Craigneish, and they've had really good success.
She's in.
Annie, you're breaking up a little bit, so maybe I'll just jump in and ask your question after all. Sorry. Annie's asking whether Alex Thompson from Sea Welding was there at the conference. At Loch Craigneish, they've had good success with seagrass restoration, and is the difference likely to be the water quality that you mentioned?
Yeah, thanks, Annie. This is really topical because I'm not sure how many of you might have seen a brand new press release that went out from Sea Welding just yesterday, which is, I think, what Alex presented on at your conference. So what they have done, they've trialled a new restoration technique, moving away from the seed planting and towards proper full transplanting of plants from a donor meadow. And they've seen absolutely fantastic results. I think they were reporting 97% survival, which I think for seagrass restoration across Scotland is pretty unheard of. So this is really groundbreaking. And I think it's partly to do with the restoration technique that they've employed, which seems to have worked really, really well for them. They're also in quite a sheltered part of the bay in Lochradenish on the west coast. They probably, I'm hesitant to say they don't have water quality issues. I'm sure they do, particularly probably sewage. But I would suspect it wasn't at this. It's not at the same levels that we have in the Firth of Forth in terms of pollution there. Yeah. I'll try and find that link for you, Annie, if you want to read a bit more about their success, because it's yeah, it's really exciting.
Well, thank you. That's great to have some more success stories too. This is all really positive. It's nice for a change. Juliet Jackson is asking whether you could say a little bit more about the mapping you're planning for seagrass next spring.
We're not quite there yet, I'm afraid. What we're doing at the moment is Project Seagrass are taking the lead on the monitoring at the moment. And then they're going to come through with a list of recommendations for the Firth of Forth basin. And then sort of based on that, we will make some decisions about what happens next. So actually, we currently don't have any seagrass work factored in for 2026. We're sort of awaiting the results of some of that data collection to really decide on what the next steps might be.
Well, thank you. I actually think that might be all of it. The rest is people saying thank you, which is super nice. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, Caitlin. That was really a great talk, and as many people in the chat are saying, really inspirational to see all the community work, and yeah, some nice positive results coming out. It's really nice to hear a more positive story. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for attending. There are some links in the chat, so check those out quick before we go offline. There's some on the press release Caitlin just mentioned is there. The booking link for our talk next week is there. Yeah, no more questions, so I will let you go. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and we hope to see you all again at another event soon.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the CIM team for organising this. It was great. Nice to see you all.
Yeah.
Bye.